Hey everyone, this is Shane Combs. Welcome back, Expanding the Zone. We are on episode 53, Matt. As I wish you a happy birthday and welcome you in. I think we've got a great show this week. As always, I'll get started by saying thank you for watching on YouTube or listening wherever you find your podcasts out there on your apps. Thank you to Dr. Chris Good for all the support and the way he supports our coverage here on the YouTube channel. But Matt, we throughout our leadership series here, now that we're on show 53, we always try to take some major sports topics and then tie them into leadership, tie them into the high school, just kind of have fun discussion. And I think we're really on to something here tonight, as I want to introduce a topic of, do they make them the way they used to, so to speak? You know what I mean? It's one of those, we've had some old school, new school discussions. I think we've always been pretty much in the middle, to be honest, if you look back through some of our show topics and review our discussion. But I guess where I'm going with this one is I analyze a bunch of different things we'll talk about in the show. Maybe it's major league pitchers, maybe it's NBA players playing, maybe it's running backs in the NFL, maybe it's all the way down to high school athletes and the number of games and workout hours they put in terms of the question I want to give out there, and I just get an opening thought from you, is if athletes are training longer, harder, and supposedly more efficiently, effectively than ever, then why in so many cases in sports at all levels, from arguably little league to high school, all the way up to even our best athletes in the world, are they less durable or more or less available? I guess that's where I want to start on. Do you have an opening thought just on the topic as you've kind of brainstormed to get ready for the show?
Well, the one thing, and you kind of touched on it there, Shane, I think the question sometimes is, are they less durable, or are we as a society and we as a sports community just more cautious, and I mean, obviously, knowledge of sports injuries over the years has increased, right? I mean, any medical knowledge over the years has only gotten better and more in depth, and that goes across the board. So it's no different with sports related injuries. We know more about concussions, obviously, than we ever have, and we know more about, other types of injuries than we ever have. So I think the question, at times is are athletes any less durable, or are we just more aware of injuries, and are they more easily recognizable, than maybe they were a generation ago? I mean, that's an interesting discussion, and I know we're going to kind of kick it around a little bit tonight, and I think we may find once again that we're in a little bit in the middle. I don't know. I know for me, I think there are times where our expanded knowledge is great. I think it helps the safety of an athlete, but I do think too, are there times maybe we're a little bit over the top when it comes to caution? Probably so at times. So I think it's going to be an interesting discussion as to where we really go with this.
Well, what got me thinking on this is, I was watching the Reds. I think it was during their Baltimore series here a couple of weeks ago, where the Reds have been playing really, really well. I know we've been real excited about that, but I'm watching a game, and it was in the Baltimore series because Jim Palmer, the Hall of Fame pitcher for the Orioles, was doing their broadcast in the booth next to Chris Welch, and they got to talking about pitch count. They got to talking about how much a major league pitcher throws throughout, and they started talking about his career. There's like 5 times in his career he threw over 300 innings. The amount of workload, and that got me thinking. So I started brainstorming and thought back, okay, well, he was a pretty hard thrower in his time, and so I thought back to who's the young stud that we were growing up, probably the closest thing, and the first name that came to my mind was Dwight Gooden. So I went and I researched him a little bit. He threw 276 innings in 1985. The top 10, you had to throw over 241. So I fast forward another decade. David Cone in 1995, 229 innings, and it just got me to thinking, we had people when we were growing up. They were on the 4-man rotation. Remember, they would throw on just the four on the every fourth day, and where now they go on the fifth day. I know you could argue that today's athletes throw a little harder. They talk about speed, spin rate, excuse me, not just speed on the gun, but spin rate on the off speed pitches. And I just, when I look back and I see guys like Greg Maddux throw 5,000 innings in their career, it just makes me wonder all the way down as someone who's coached high school baseball for 28 years. And we always had the 10-inning rule. Now we have the pitch count. I know you've coached a lot in the little league. When we were growing up in the little league, it used to be, well, they're okay to throw as long as they're not throwing the curveball. We're now, and you can help me here far better than I can. There's a pitch count even all the way down
Right.
specifically in the little league on how they throw. Just what's your take on something that we both have a great passion for, just on terms of like the pitching or the baseball aspect of this?
Well, I think it begs the question, Shayne, like when it comes to things like pitch count, you have to ask how effective it is, because I guess here's my thing with this. Okay. And I'm talking specifically pitching here because I think there's going to be some other examples in other sports we talk about where I'm all for, the different approach we take now is maybe that we did in yesteryear. But with pitching, it's always amazed me because I feel like I see more arm injuries now. Okay, at every level. You see high school kids getting Tommy John. I mean, when we were growing up, I never remember a high school kid getting a Tommy John surgery. Okay, now you could say, well, maybe they didn't diagnose him correctly. Maybe they didn't have that surgery as readily available for the common Joe back then, right? Maybe that was more just a Major League Baseball thing. But but at the same time, you've seen pitchers, okay, come through the high school ranks who severely hurt their arm. I mean, they can't pitch, correct? I mean, like they're hurting. And like, I don't remember kids in our generation hurting their arm to the extent they couldn't throw. Was there arm soreness? Was there some damage there that we didn't know about? Maybe. But to completely have to be on the shelf, right, and not be able to pitch.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in our generation, kids grew up without much of a pitch count. I don't remember in our little league having a lot of rules about pitch count. There might have been some, I can't remember. As we got into high school, I know the inning rules sort of started because that we were like, it had just started to where they'd put any restrictions on that at all. Because I know like in the late 80s, you could just throw for forever, But my point is, and you just mentioned it with major league players throwing 250 innings. I remember seeing a replay of that game between the Yankees and the Mariners. I think it was Game 5 of a divisional playoff series where David Cone threw 160 some pitches or something crazy. I mean, you would never in a million years see that now. I mean, a pitcher hits 100 pitches and the announcers start talking about it, right? Like, oh, how long do you think they're going to let him go? That was his 100th pitch. And yet we see more arm injuries and more problems now. So I guess my question is are things like the pitch count working? Let's take this down to the high school level for a minute, Shayne. Are things like the pitch count working? Or are we just doing that to cover our own butts? Basically, are we just doing that to say, I'll hear it in Little League. I'll hear the people that help run our Little League say, we got to protect these kids' arms. And I think to myself, well, this one kid's out here snapping off a curveball every third pitch. But you're telling me you want to protect his arm because we're only going to let him throw 50 pitches every 3 days? You see what I'm saying? Like, are we doing this more to cover our own, just to cover our own liability? Or do we honestly, in our hearts and minds, think that pitch counts are saving arms? Because I'm not seeing evidence of that.
Well, it is. It's fascinating. And as a high school coach of 28 years, I've talked to so many people about this, and we sit there and we count the game pitch, but we don't count the entire bullpen. We don't count the 25, 30 extra warm-up pitches in between innings and all those different things. We don't count the next 2 days where they go play shortstop or third base and turn it loose across the infield. You
Sure.
know what I'm saying? It's one of those particular things where you just start to wonder. Like I heard one of the top pitching coaches in the country say at a clinic here a couple of years ago, Johnny doesn't have a rubber arm because he can throw every day. Johnny has a rubber arm because he does throw every day. And he
Yeah.
talked about the proper way to train the arm and the proper way to go. And I guess it got me thinking. And there are certain things I understand. You mentioned how we diagnose things better. Like when I look at certain notes and I think to myself, my goodness, Emmitt Smith had like 8 out of 10 years where he carried the ball at the NFL level over 300 times. Like that,
Right.
as a running back, that's brutal. You know what I mean? That's
Right.
insane. I understand with the money involved in the amount of money where some of that's changed. But then I guess I turn it over to the NBA. I don't understand that. What the load management.
Right.
I read an article in preparation for the show. If you go back over the last 3 years and you take like 48 different people that have made the All-Star game, they've had like, they've averaged a missed 28 games a year in terms of over the course of the year. 5 guys missed the entire season. So I obviously, if you miss an entire season, there was an injury involved that you couldn't do anything about. But I guess this load management where someone is okay and they're playing, like the incredible kid that just got drafted #1 for the Spurs, and they're talking about, do you think he'll reach his 65 games this year that he has to play to be up for Rookie of the Year? And I'm
Right.
thinking, like, what do you mean? Like, what I'm saying? It's now, is that because kids are younger and we're putting their bodies in positions they're not ready for? Like when we were growing up, the elite big men, your Patrick Ewing, your Elijah Wan, they would have been playing their 2, 3, 4 years of college,
Right.
playing, only coming up to what in college? They're 35, 40 games and then making the jump when they're 22, 23 years old. Does that play a factor? Are kids accelerating at such a young age? I guess sport to sport, I'm having trouble wrapping my mind around just how much are we pushing the athlete any differently now, because I think as high school coaches and high school leaders, we do need to have a sense of how hard to push our kids or how much to pull back. And I guess that's why I start at the highest level and think about those things. It just blows my mind week in, week out. I watch a lot more NBA than you, but I mean, it's nothing to sit down on a random Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday night and an all-star on each team is taking the night off, and it's just load management.
Well, I guess here's where I'm at with it, Shane. And I think you do have to look at it on probably a case by case, sport by sport basis to an extent, because look, one of the things I've always tried to guard against, and we've talked about this on our show when we've done some of our shows like old school, new school, things like that. I think you have to guard against thinking that, the generation that you grew up in did it right, and then everybody else has done it wrong since. I think there's a lot of people that think that way sometimes, right? And if you think about it, since the beginning of time, every generation thinks they were a little bit tougher than the previous generation, right? I mean, when we were kids, we heard about our parents having to walk to school and then get up at 5 a.m. and feed the cows or whatever they did, you know what I mean? And so we had it easy. And now my kids, have it way easier than I had it, if you ask me. Right. So every generation, kind of thinks that way. And I think that we have to be careful of not evolving and understanding that we have gained knowledge over time when it comes to injuries and when it comes to prevention. And I think that we need to be able to use those things to our advantage. For instance, I remember I'll use this example. I remember when I was teaching my kids to ride their bikes as little kids, right? We put a helmet on them. And I remember, some people thinking, oh, why do we put helmets on kids? We didn't have helmets when we rode a bike. Well, we know more now about head injuries and possible, my mom held me on her lap sometimes in the car too. We have car seats now. I don't think we're arguing, the validity of those. I think we grow as a society, we gain equipment, with better equipment, right, to protect ourselves, and because we know more about certain injuries. Look at head injuries, right? Let's take football head injuries and how much we've learned on those over the years. I remember when you and I went to the Football Hall of Fame together, you had made the comment that I think it was Lynn Swan's helmet looked like something a kid would wear at trick or treat. I mean, this
Yeah,
guy played. I mean, this helmet wouldn't have protected anybody. And the helmets these guys wear now look like, space age, top technology.
sure.
Why? Well, we've learned what it takes to protect the head and things like that. So what my point is, I think we have to understand that knowledge is good. And some of the knowledge we've gained over the last couple decades, we need to utilize. My point is this: when we start just, putting rules in place to protect people there's no evidence that it's protecting people. Like back to the pitching example. What evidence do we have? And maybe there's some out there that pitch counts in high school are protecting arms, because I'm seeing more injuries than I've ever seen. I mean, is there data to show that since the pitch count's been put in, or since even the inning rule's been put in, that we have less arm injuries? Because I mean, you've coached baseball, I've watched baseball. You can't convince me there's less arm injuries now. And so it begs the question: Are kids not throwing enough? Are kids not throwing the right way? I mean, are we not training our arms in a way where they're durable? But at the same time, are kids throwing? Are kids also playing more games than they've ever played? Legion baseball. I mean, taking baseball, right? But if you look at just injuries across the board, are our high school athletes, when you talked about load management, are they playing so much now? I know girls that go to volleyball at 9 o'clock and then go to basketball at noon and then play softball in the summer, and all of a sudden, are some kids even at a high school age overdoing it? I don't know.
Well, I guess the high school level is where I would go next. I mean, one thing I had down on my notes there, we freaked out a little bit when we thought about the idea of going from 20 to 22 games. And I don't know if that had to do with playing too much. It might have had more to do with scheduling, like in basketball, or we talk about when volleyball stretched out to 5 sets instead of 3. Games were getting longer, even though it had faster pace and so forth. And I've talked to 3 football coaches, not head coaches, but coaches that are much involved in their programs. There are 3 different size schools. All 3 schools, I would say, in their respective divisions, would be considered by most to be above average programs throughout the last decade. And a common theme that they're all talking to me about right now is the weightlifting. Every one of them involved in some sort of outside agency, like an AP prep, workouts, all the different things. And they talked about trying to establish depth and not having kids go both ways and all these different things. And again, I'm just thinking back over time. I think of all the different kids we've watched play both ways in a high school football setting. And I just don't remember, again, the breakdown of bodies, the different injuries, some of the different things I've seen over the last probably 5 to 10 years. And again, maybe it's just coincidence in some of the teams I follow or the teams I'm around. It's something to, you said something earlier stuck out to me, Matt, and I want to come back to it because maybe you're onto something. It's something I never thought of. Do you think in leadership we're a little bit guilty of protecting ourselves?
Yeah.
Instead of stepping out and really analyzing and knowing our athlete, trusting our training, trusting our ability to be around the sport now for 30, 35, 40 years, do you think sometimes we put things in place just because it protects us, saying, well, we only went to this hour limit, or we only went to this rep limit? You
Right.
mentioned that earlier. Maybe expand on that a little bit, because maybe you're onto something there. Do you think sometimes in the land of education, coaching, leadership, that maybe that's just the world we live in, that we're a little guilty of that?
Yeah, I do. I'll be honest with you. I do. The short answer to that is yes. I think that we live in a society where when something goes wrong, we want to blame somebody, and that's the unfortunate part of it. And so I think when athletes get hurt, you know, instead of the cold hard facts being that injuries do happen in sports sometimes and we have to deal with these things, a lot of times I think coaches don't want to be, have the finger pointed at them. Well, what if they would have done this differently, or what if they would have done this differently, or that kid's ankle had been bothering him in practice and they played anyway, or it's almost like now as a coach, when you let a kid play through a minor injury, people look at you as like you're Bear Bryant back in the Texas A&M days, and you're not giving kids water when it's 112 degrees, right? It's like, well, no, he had he had a little bit of a sprained ankle. We taped it up and we went. To me, that's part of sports. Now, I think the other thing is, we have athletic trainers now at almost every school. But again, I would argue that in some cases, those athletic trainers are nervous about putting a kid back into play before, you know what I mean? Before he or she is, I don't always want to say ready, because that's their job, but I'm saying, I think athletic trainers in their mind run a risk too, right? If somebody gets
no
hurt
question.
on their watch. So again, we take extra precaution.
Don't you think they make decisions all the time that in their most honest moment, they think, hey, this kid's probably okay, but I'm not about to put my name stamp to it?
Well, I know it happens because when I coached, as a head coach for 24 years or whatever, and I know how trainers in 1999, 2000, 2001 reacted to things as compared to trainers today. And I think that's just, they're like anybody else. They're a product of our environment, our society right now. But I think that it's this fine line of, and this is what I was trying to get out earlier. We have more knowledge and we need to use that, right? For instance, it's not okay to play a kid when he gets his bell rung anymore. And I'm 100% in agreement with that.
Absolutely.
We know so much about that now, right? So that's one of those cases where back in the day we would have just kept playing, but we didn't know. We didn't know how dangerous it was to play. So that's where we need to use that knowledge to our advantage, and we protect kids. I'm all for that. But my fear is sometimes we just err on the side of caution every single time just because it covers us. And it's not always doing that athlete a favor. I think sometimes, kids now, like you talked about, there probably are times where they don't have enough recovery time. It's not just, hey, let's go to open gym for an hour and a half, 3 times a week. Now it's, let's go to a personal trainer. Let's get our shooting workouts in. Let's go to open gym. Let's play. I do think there's some possibility that kids, even at 16 years old, can overdo it. I'm not one of these people that says, oh, they're young. They can. I think we have to be smart about it. My point to all this is, I think we have to be able to back up our opinions with some sort of proof, with some sort of data, so that we know what we're doing.
Well, it is really interesting. And I guess where I want to transition to with all the sports talk is into the job place, or the workplace. As our student athletes grow up through time, era by era, do you feel like we've created a culture that makes it more acceptable to miss work, or to take some shortcuts, or to do some different things? I think back to, we obviously were raised by, parents who, you go to school, go to work, go to practice. Right. You know what I mean? Like some players will tell me, hey, coach, I only missed 3 practices this year. And I'm thinking, I didn't miss 3 practices from 7th grade through senior year of 3 sports. You know what I'm saying? Like, right. it's or even adults in the workplace. Remember, we joked on a show
Right.
earlier about, the 7 habits, sharpening the saw didn't mean take every Friday off. I mean,
Right.
it
Right.
was it was a situation of, I guess what I'm asking is does it create a culture to where it's okay to step back and do less? Is it okay not to go to work if you have a runny nose? Is it okay to does that make sense? I
Yeah.
guess what I'm trying to do is take a passion of ours, which is sports and working with young people and working with student athletes, but then putting it into an adult situation on why we believe in sports so much, why we believe in the things it teaches in terms of those types of things. And I guess my question for you, because I've even seen that transition in my adult life in terms of the number of people who missed work 20 years ago in comparison to the number of people who miss work today, and it's borderline alarming.
Right.
Um, do you think there's anything that's linked there in terms of way of life, in terms of habits, or am I reaching?
No, I don't. I never considered that angle before, but I don't think you're reaching. I'll never. I, I'm reminded of the words and I can't believe I'm going to give this guy some publicity here but Joe Griesheimer, former assistant coach. Gotta love Joe. And in all honesty, very successful school administrator, great person, but he was full of some one-liners that always stick in my head to today. But I'll never forget the time that he looked at me and he asked me if I was hurt or if I was injured. Okay. And of course, I was 15 years old. So what did I ask? What's the difference? and, and and he told me if I was hurt to keep playing, if I was injured to seek medical attention. So I've always kind of lived by that. Like, if you don't feel like going to work, are you hurt or are you injured?
Mhm.
If you have a headache, you're hurt. Right. If you have 103 temperature, you're injured. So I do think there's probably some truth to that. I think we laugh about it, but in all honesty, we do have some people that have grown up in a generation where if you're hurt, then you just don't participate. You don't battle through a certain level of discomfort. Let's just be real honest when it comes to sports. And I know that, again, this may not be a popular opinion today. If you only play on days where you feel really, really good, your participation is going to be limited. I mean, I don't know how many days when I used to play basketball that I felt 100% just perfect. It just doesn't happen. It doesn't happen today. If I only played golf when I felt physically great, then I wouldn't play much golf. I mean, there's certain
Well, even
things.
in the workplace, if every time the alarm went off in the morning, if you only got up and went to work on the days you really were awake and felt like, hey, let's
Oh,
go to
yeah,
work at
right.
6:30.
Right. I mean, there's how many days you just fire out of bed and just pumped up. I mean, it's just usually just not the way it goes, right? So I do think that that our society has become that way a little bit. But I don't want to make light, as we talk athletically here. I don't want to make light of true injuries either,
Right.
and because I do think that it is our job as coaches and as school officials, right? It is our job to put the safety of a student athlete high on our priority list, right? We need to take that very, very seriously. But I think again, we need to take it seriously and not be so soft and so scared to make a mistake that we just tell kids that it's okay to not participate because you just don't feel quite yourself today. That's not, I don't think, what we want to become. We want to learn what is serious, how to recognize serious things, how to prevent serious things, right? And do it that way for sure.
Well, I think that takes me to the bottom of of my notes here. So I guess I'll start us in on some closing. I always try to look at it solution based. I always try to use this as professional development. And I've thought so much about this over the last couple of weeks. I do think there's something there in terms of athletes performing not necessarily less effectively or productively, but less in terms of total output. I do think athletes are training harder. I think better. I think more. What's the word? I guess they're being trained by professionals or outside
Right.
people, that are, not just a basketball coach treating you how, teaching you how to dribble. It's someone teaching you how to run, jump, lift, stretch, all those things, nutrition. I mean, I've heard it all.
Right.
And so I am fascinated by those things. I think the two things that have really jumped out at me that you talked about, I think a lot of it just comes in a time period thing of where we have to be aware of accountability. We have to, as leaders, especially, we are forced to take on a lot of different trainings and a lot of different things for the very things you're talking about, and the awareness. I think when you get to the higher levels, let's face it, money plays a factor.
Sure.
If you're talking about why certain guys don't throw innings, or running backs don't carry the ball, or NBA players don't play 82 games, it's a lot of they're going to protect their investment.
Well, I mean, you brought up a Reds example, Shayne. Right now, Hunter Green has been on the DL, and if I understand his injury proper or accurately, it's a hip injury, right? It's not even what they deem to be a serious hip injury. They're just afraid that it'll lead to him compensating for the discomfort and hurting his arm. You see what I'm saying? And delivery.
Mm-hmm.
So what did they do? They put him on the DL, and they're going to do hip strengthening exercises.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in 1975, Hunter Green would have been expected to pitch through that, right? And look, what's right, what's wrong? I don't know. Maybe if Hunter Green goes out, pitches through that, and hurts his arm, and it's a career-ending type of situation, then that's awful, right? And not only is that awful for him, but like you just mentioned, the Reds are out a bunch of money. They just signed him to a long-term deal. But my point is, when dollars are involved at that level, and even at the high school level where dollars aren't involved, but you're dealing with a kid, right? You're dealing with a minor that you want to
Mm-hmm.
protect. We sometimes take extra precaution. And I guess that's up to debate, right? Whether that's why we did this show. Is that good? Is that bad? Is that,
Yeah.
it'd be interesting to hear other people's opinions on that.
Yeah. What's pushing too much? I guess that's the biggest takeaway I've been trying to find is, when is it pushing the athlete too hard? When are you
Right.
not pushing them hard enough? So again, when are you physically putting them in harm? But again, when are you starting to teach them that it's okay to take days off, or it's okay to not give your very best? So
Right.
it's a leadership dynamic that I think is fascinating. And I think that the hardest thing leaders are balancing now, that I think you've brought to my attention during the show, is the time we live in. It is the microscope. It is the accountability piece. It is um, it is just the responsibility of, why did you put them out there in that spot? Why did you make that decision? And I think that's well said. I mean, it's really a good show. I'd love to get more and more feedback. I know we put it out on social media. We're out there on Facebook and Twitter, and obviously. I'd love to see some growth of the discussion and get some feedback. Matt, any closing thoughts here before we close this out to show 53?
Well, I guess, bringing it to our level, right? Bringing it to a high school level. I guess I would just challenge coaches to ask themselves the question too, when you're putting together your off season workouts, especially, okay? Because from what I see, and let me ask you this, Shayne, maybe you don't agree with this. This is just my opinion. I feel like athletes, if there's any overwork, right? If there's any time of year where load management, to use an NBA term, is an issue with high school kids, To me, it's the off season. Okay. And the reason is I feel like coaches sometimes we as coaches think our program's the most important. And if we're not doing this, the program down the road is, and they're gaining an advantage. So we have to go 2 hours a day, 3 or 4 days a week. Well, think about this for a minute. If the football coach thinks that, and the basketball coach thinks that, and the track coach thinks that, the baseball coach thinks that, all of a sudden, if you get a 3-sport athlete, what are they doing? Then they're going 6 hours a day, 3 days a week. And I've seen it. I've seen it with my own eyes. I've seen a girl. I used the example earlier. I've seen girls go to volleyball for 2 hours, come to basketball for 2 hours, go play, you know, off-season softball, travel softball, for a team. Go to AP prep and work out, right? Get their weight room time in. So all of a sudden in the off season, there are kids putting in hours upon hours, and maybe you can make an argument they're going too far, because let's face it probably doesn't happen during the season, right? You coach girls basketball. If a girl's playing basketball for Paint Valley during December, that's pretty much what she was doing. She was playing basketball for Paint
And
Valley.
you're never, well, in basketball, you're never going to be criticized for playing a kid 32 minutes. You know what I mean? In volleyball, you're never going to be criticized for playing them in the game. Baseball, I guess, the pitching aspect, or in football,
right.
You're right. So much of what we're talking about is away from the season. It's away from
that's what
the
I
game.
mean. I mean, chances are a girl's not playing a basketball game for her high school team, and then when the game's over at 10 o'clock, going to go lift weights, and then get up at 8 o'clock the next day and work out for volleyball team. That's not really happening because of the way the seasons are lined up, right? It's basketball season or it's volleyball season. There may be a little weight training in there. Like if you're a football kid, you may lift some during basketball, football, or basketball and baseball. I get that. But you're not going out putting pads on and hit. I mean, you may be doing some weight workout. What I'm saying is in the off season, sometimes if we're not careful as coaches, we all demand so much of our athletes' time that we can put that strain on them. You see, so my biggest thing I would challenge coaches is really ask yourselves, what do I need to do for my team to be successful? And then how much after that is just more for my own peace of mind? And I think that's what we got cut out, because I think sometimes, I know for me as a basketball coach, I used to ask myself in the summer, what is the minimum I need to do in order for us to be successful? And that's what I want to, and I know that sounds a little kind of uncompetitive, like what's the minimum? But what I mean by that is I want to put as little strain on my athletes as I have to in the off season, knowing that I'm going to have some that go up and beyond, but I want them to be able to play other sports. I want them to be able to develop physically and not just go out and play basketball all the time. I want them to have that variety, because I think that's healthy. I think that prevents injuries when you use different muscle groups, when you're not just using the same repetitive motion all the time, right? You're playing different things. I want them to have unstructured play. You and I grew up in a generation where there was tons of unstructured play. We'd go to the park and play. We'd go in our driveway and play. We'd play wiffle ball in the backyard. We'd play, right? There's not as much of that anymore. It's just a different time. And I think sometimes kids that have that unstructured play, again, they get injured less because their bodies are used to different types of movements. There's all kinds of ways to look at this. But my point is, I think as educators and as coaches, what's the part we can do? I think we can be proactive in sharing our kids, sharing our athletes, so that we don't try to overwork them in every single sport they play.
It's really good stuff. It is. It's a true defining of a word, toughness, that we've always thought of in a lot of different ways, generation to generation. And it's teaching the accountability and responsibility through what we think high school athletics is, and then, as we've said, how it kind of goes into the adult life and what that means to someone, throughout their throughout their entire career and whatever career path they choose. Good stuff. Well, man, I really enjoyed it. Again, thank you to Dr. Chris Good for all the support throughout the YouTube channel. You can check us out anywhere on the podcast apps. You find it. It's Expanding the Zone. Again, I'm Shayne Combs. He's Matt Combs. We appreciate everybody listening. We'll talk to you next time.